Good morning again, and welcome to the National Naval Aviation Museum. Thank you so much for coming out today to our Discovery Saturday. My name is Shelley Ragsdale. I'm with the foundation, and we have these events, Discovery Saturday, once a month, and I'll tell you afterwards about the next one we've got coming up for June. We're real excited to have Colonel Miller here today, and for right now I'd like to introduce Lieutenant Colonel Terry Bryan. He is a retired Marine. He's going to be help facilitating the presentation today. He's a museum volunteer and, like I said, a retired Marine. So join me in welcoming Lieutenant Colonel Bryan.
Thanks, Shelley. Good morning.
Good morning.
Again, welcome to your National Naval Aviation Museum's Discovery Saturday program. How do you introduce a member of the greatest generation? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Terry Bryan, United States Marine Corps. And I have the distinct honor and pleasure to introduce my friend and fellow Marine, Colonel Justin McCarthy Mac Miller, United States Marine Corps. For just a very few minutes, I'd like to set the stage and put World War II in the Pacific in perspective. Unlike the European theater, where the culture was a Western culture, much like ours, the Japanese culture was significantly different. Every battle against the Japanese was a fight to the death, with no quarter given, no quarter asked. Surrender was certainly not in their DNA, not for the soldiers, sailors, or airmen. By July 1942, the Japanese Empire had encompassed virtually the entire Pacific Basin. The Japanese successfully attacked Pearl Harbor, took Wake Island and Guam, invaded and conquered the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, and seized the British base of Singapore. They conquered Burma, seized the Netherlands, East Indies, and British Borneo. The Japanese advance came to a halt at two heroic battles in 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May and the Battle of Midway in June. One of the first significant Marine Corps amphibious assaults was the Battle for Guadalcanal, the first counteroffensive in the Pacific Campaign, and the establishment of a critical airfield named Henderson Field. Soon it would be home to the famous Marine Cactus Air Force. The battle, conducted from August 1942 to February 1943, resulted in the loss of over 1,000 Marines and 550 GIs. Japanese lost 25,000 killed and ended up evacuating 13,000 as non-combat effective. The war of attrition that Admiral Yamamoto said Japan could not win had just begun. From 1942 until 43, however, neither side could muster the land, sea, or air power necessary to take the offensive and seize the initiative from the other. But then, the offensive began in mid-43 through September 1945. Admiral Nimitz's strategy was simple: go for the throat. It was designed to move directly toward Japan. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, also known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot in 1944, and the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The invasion of the Philippines followed, continued with invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Many of these places are familiar to us. But what about Espiritu Santo, Bougainville, Torquay, Rabaul, Oreille Point Airfield, and Rota? Well, Mac remembers them well. Born 1914, that makes Mac a very young 98-year-old. He attended the Naval Academy, was instrumental in establishing Marine Squadron VMF 214, flying Grumman Wildcats. The squadron trained in the F4 at NAS Centro, El Centro, before embarking on the escort carrier USS Barnes, CVE-20, in December 43 for deployment to the South Pacific. VMF-217 transitioned to the F4U, Corsair, and flew combat missions in the Solomon Islands in 1944 against the Japanese at Rabaul, New Guinea, a major critical Japanese base. In June 44, the squadron embarked on the USS Santee, another escort carrier, CVE-29, for deployment to Guam. The squadron disembarked onto Orode Airfield in early August 1944 and flew combat sorties against airfields on the islands of Rota and Pagan in the Marianas. In October 44, Colonel Miller took command of VMF 321, and in early 1945, the squadron returned to the continental U.S. for retraining. Let me put that in perspective. Matt commanded 2 fighter squadrons in the Pacific and was executive officer of one of the groups, all before his 30th birthday. Mac joined the reserves in 1948 at the end of the war and continued flying. As a local businessman, Mac owned many radio stations, including our own WCOA, being one of them. And today, Mac can be seen at Pensacola Beach and the Pensacola Yacht Club. Impressive. One can only help to be that active when you're 98 years old. For distinguished combat during World War II, Mac was awarded 3 flying crosses, distinguished flying crosses, 11 air medals, and 4 battle stars. He's seen it all, and now we get to hear what it was really like. It's my pleasure to present to you Colonel Mac Miller, United States Marine Corps. You're welcome.
Thank the staff for inviting me. We wondered how I happened to wind up at the Pacific, as we mentioned. Growing up, World War I was just about over. It was over. And my heroes and idols were not movie stars or television stars or musicians, because we didn't have any television, of course. The radio didn't come until I was 12 years old. But anyway, my idols and role models were the pursuit pilots of the Allied forces against the Germans, and they were flying some funny-looking little airplanes that were biplanes, open cockpit, fixed landing gear, and an engine that rotated. I just don't understand how that worked, but the whole engine rotated. There were Spads and Newports, and they sortied forth every morning and engaged in battle with Baron von Richthofen's fighters. And it was sort of hinted that they lived in chateaus and had wonderful food and lots of wine and beautiful mamsells around and whatnot. All that sounded pretty good to me. As a matter of fact, that just reinforced my desire to be a pursuit pilot, because I thought maybe that sounded like more fun than having a job in a factory or an office or a farm or something like that. So I was intent upon becoming a pursuit pilot. There were lots of little pamphlets and booklets and things that were describing the action over there in World War I, and just whetted my appetite. I decided, Lord, I want to be a pursuit pilot. So about 1932 or so, I was in Hawaii. My father was Commodore of the little free destroyers there, and I was in command of about a 9-foot, 105-pound solid redwood surfboard. And I thought at that time it might be best way to become a pursuit pilot, to be a military pursuit pilot, to become a military officer. So I made applications to the governor of Hawaii, which was a territory at that time. He had the right to appoint a midshipman to the Naval Academy and a cadet to West Point. So I got my name on the list, and of course he naturally wanted to appoint youngsters who lived there regularly rather than the Naval Officer's son, but I wound up fourth alternate on the list to go to the Naval Academy. So while I was waiting to do that, my high school senior year, I went to West Point Prep School where we learned a little bit about geography and history, but mostly they had all the previous information on what you had to do to get into the academies to pass the exam. So we perused them a lot, and we learned a whole lot about each one of those years that they had these entrance exams. So the first younger guy that was appointed went to the academy and failed the entrance exam, and the second guy went and failed the entrance exam, and the third guy went. Meantime, time is fleeting. During this time, all the rest of the youngsters in the class of 1937 had already reported to the Naval Academy in the spring, and we were still deciding who was going to go there. And when I was in high school, I was really a lousy math student. I couldn't remember the theorems in geometry very well, and it took me a long time to even discover what X, the unknown object, meant in algebra. So finally, as a fourth alternate, I took the exam and, of course, passed it with a breeze. So instead of reporting in the spring of '33, I reported to the Naval Academy in late fall. And by that time, my other classmates had been studying solid geometry, spherical geometry, trigonometry, and they were into something called calculus, which I never understood why we were going to take calculus or what it was about. So all during my short period of time at the Naval Academy, I always stood somewhere like the top 5% and the bottom 3% of my classes in math. And at that time, the budget for the Navy was so tight that even though there were 350 or 400 midshipmen would graduate in my class, only one half of them would become regular ensign United States Navy or second lieutenant U.S. Marine Corps, because the budget was so bad. The rest of them would be turned out as ensign United States Navy Reserve with no job in the middle of a very deep depression, in which about a third of the people were, about a third of the job force were unemployed. And I kept thinking about that after a while, and I realized that if only one half of the class was going to get a job, I wasn't going to be one of them. And furthermore, if you wanted to be a flight officer eventually, a pilot, only 20% of them would be available to be selected. On top of that, if you got selected and managed to get through the flight training program, you might be assigned to a patrol boat squadron or a scout squadron or a torpedo squadron, none of which appealed to me. So I figured out pretty soon this is not the proper path to become a pursuit pilot. In the meantime, I happened to learn that the Marine Corps flew fighters and bombers, dive bombers, same way that the Navy did, but they didn't have all those other things, and there was a shortcut to become a pursuit pilot, fighter pilot they call it now, and that was you enlisted as a private in the Marine Corps with the understanding that you would be sent to what they call elimination base for a few months. If you graduated from that, then you would be appointed as an aviation cadet and sent to flight training. And this sounded more like it to me. So I resigned as a midshipman, signed up as a seaman second class, and was sitting around waiting to eventually be sent to flight training. So they finally sent me to Anacostia Airfield, Naval Air Station, where we went through the elimination base. Don't know why that was. We learned how to do Morse code audio and Morse code as they flashed it on the big ships and different flag things and a little star navigation, and in other words, nothing that would have any value at all to a pursuit pilot. But at any rate, I did not get eliminated, so they put me on inactive duty, waiting orders, And while I was doing that, I thought, well, maybe I ought to just learn to be a pilot. That might be a step in the right direction. So at that time, President Roosevelt had a program called the Civilian Pilot Training Program, where for $3 an hour, you got the airplane, the civilian pilot, and the gasoline. And you learned to be a civilian pilot. So I took that course in the little Piper Cub, which is a little 60 horsepower high-wing monoplane. And after that, I still hadn't gotten orders, so there was another course called the aerobatic course, which was in a biplane very much like the World War I, a Waco sport plane, and we learned aerobatics, spins and rolls and John Zells and Immelmans and split S's and the like. And about the time I completed that course, I got my orders to go to Naval Air Station Jacksonville, which was a brand new air station that had just been commissioned. So I showed up December the 30th, 1940, along with a bunch of other youngsters, to be in the first class at Naval Air Station Jacksonville. There were about 19 Navy pilots, students, and 2 Marine students. The other was Lieutenant General. He was not a Lieutenant General at that time, but he wound up Lieutenant General Bob Keller, that became the 3rd senior Marine aviator. Anyway, while we were there, what we were doing was primary training in what we call the Yellow Peril, which was either an N2S, a Stearman plane, or an N3N, which was built by the Naval Gun Factory. At any rate, they resembled very much the same planes that we had in World War I, except the engine didn't revolve, the propeller revolved. And while we were there in Jacksonville, there was nothing much exciting happened. We just went through the program and how to fly and navigate a little bit and that sort of thing. And then we got our orders to go to Opelika, which was a little Marine air station near Miami, and there they had assembled a whole lot of what at one time were the #1 fighters and dive bombers in the Navy. They were biplanes with open cockpit, fixed gear, very much like World War I. And they had quite a series of those there, and we had to check out and everything that was there. We were located between the Atlantic Ocean and the Everglades, and some people, of course, some of those aircraft are pretty old, some people know stuff in the Everglades. One of the things that we were practicing, of course, was aerial gunnery, in which one of the students towed a target which looked like a giant wind swing, probably about 10 feet by maybe 4 or 5 feet diameter. And we practiced low side runs aiming at the target and high side runs, and the most fun of all was overhead run. And we almost had our first casualty of it at that point. The way it worked is the tow target would go along, let's say, on a 90-degree course. The instructor and 4 or 5 students would go above about 2,000 or 3,000 feet and ahead on the same course. And then we would turn and fly directly above the target, roll over and go head down and shoot at the target. And the way you tell whether they won or not was, I don't know how the guns suffered this, but everybody had a different colored bullet in each plane. And they would make a mark on the sleeve when he went through. So I did that, and it came time to pull out, and I yanked back on the stick, and nothing happened. It wouldn't move. So here am I at about 6,000 feet, heading straight down, and I just can't get the stick to move. So I thought, well, it will move, it will roll, so I'll try to do something. I don't know what else to do. So I rolled it a bunch of times, left and right, and banged the runners and whatnot, and suddenly it cleared up. And I took back up and joined up with it. Sometime later, they found out that some of the mechanics had been working on the wires that connected the stick to the ailerons back there. They left a block of wood or two as pliers or something like this, and every time you went over like that, they flew up and blocked off control. The other thing we did was a lot of dive bombing, and they had drawn a bunch of concentric circles like a target with a target in the middle. And of course, we were all in competition with the Navy pilots, both for shooting and trying to hit the target best. But at any rate, you did a straight 90-degree dive on this thing and dropped these little funny bombs that made it smoke when they hit, so you could score that way. And one young Navy student pilot, Frank Mears from Washington, D.C., unfortunately, either got so concentrated on the target that he forgot to pull out, or perhaps something happened to his controls like mine, and he wound up dead center, plane and all. So that was our first casualty. So we graduated from that program after a few months, and we were waiting orders, and I thought, wouldn't it be nice if I could just go out to the Fleet Marine Force in San Diego and fly real fighters. By that time, they finally had a plane that was not a biplane, it was a monoplane, and it was called the F4U Wildcat. So, waiting my orders, and they came. I'd been a very terrible instrument pilot. I'd done pretty well otherwise, but I hated being under the hood with trying to deal with the needle-ball airspeed and all that kind of stuff. And my orders came, Pensacola, Florida, Navy Squadron 3, instructor instruments. Well, that was just kind of a letdown. It wasn't the right way to become a pursuit pilot, but anyway, I did that. And for about a year, we instructed the youngsters in the SNJ, which was a monoplane. And it was something new for us because we could push a button and the gear would come up and the flaps would go down, and had an electric prop and would change the pitch on, a canopy cover, and the pilot in the front was the instructor, the pilot in the back seat was a student, and you were connected by what was called a gosport, which was connected to the instructor's mouth, and a tube that ran into the ears of the hapless student back there. And you could usually understand what the instructor said, especially if he was mad. So that went on, and we also, in addition to trying to get them where they could fly and not kill themselves with only the needle-ball airspeed, rate of climb, down 70 and so forth, we were practicing. They had a low-frequency radio range here in Pensacola, which had a beam that when you were on the beam towards the base, the airport or whatever it was, it had a steady buzz. If you went to the right, it went da, a, or the left, da, did. And we always had to make sure that this youngster finally, when he got above the radio, it would be a dead silence called the code of silence. And that way, then they could make the letdown. Of course, this was of absolutely no use to anybody in the fleet because we didn't have any radio aids out there in the fleet. There's certainly no low-frequency ranges or anything else, but it was good practice for the instrument flying. But one time we were flying on the Mobile range at about 6,000 to 7,000 feet, I guess it was, and my guy behind me, it was his last flight, and he had never recognized the code of silence. So I really wanted to get him to do that. And as we approached the Mobile airport, there was a giant thunderstorm there, and I decided we had to go in and recognize the code. I had no idea what a downdraft on a major cumulonimbus could do, but we found the code, and I turned one of the Navy to go back, and we lost 4,500 feet of altitude with the nose of my aircraft up, full power, and the whole beam that we're in was So we wound up about 1,500 feet over the water. So that went on, that kind of thing for a while, and December the 7th of 1942, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And we were sitting in Splinter Hill, which was, at the time was the Bachelor Officer Quarters, and listened to the radio, and this all came over. And of course, Orson Welles, about a few years before that, had put on the program where he had men from Mars attacking us here and burning our cities and all this kind of stuff. And a lot of people believed that. But in this case, I thought, well, let's turn it to another channel. Maybe this is a production like that. Maybe it's true. And we turned to every channel, and it was true. We were at war with the Japanese. And of course, then is when we really wanted to go out and fly real fighters and become pursuit pilots. So orders came in. Bob Keller got to go out and fly the fighters. I got orders to staff and command school in Quantico. I'm still not a pursuit pilot. So I went to the staff and command school in Quantico for about, I don't know how many months. Everybody else there was an infantryman and artilleryman, and we studied all kinds of tactics for infantry and artillery and table of organization and practiced a lot on the ground and had nothing at all to do with aviation. It wasn't even mentioned. So when that was over, I thought, surely I'm going to get to become a pursuit pilot sooner or later. So my orders came in, and sure enough, they were to San Diego to report to the Fleet Marine Force. And I reported to General Sanderson after about a month later. By this time, believe it or not, in just 2 years, we'd been promoted from second lieutenant to first lieutenant to captain to major, because somebody had to get promoted because the thing was growing so fast. So I reported to General Sanderson, said, I've got good news for you, Major. We're going to form a brand new fighter squadron called VMF 217, and you are going to be the commanding officer. And you're going to report to the Marine Station in El Centro, California, where you'll be training in the Wildcat F4Fs, and you are to assemble the squadron, get the material, get the men, get the aircraft, train them, and take them overseas. And I said, well, General, that's a great honor, and I truly appreciate it, but I've never even been in a Marine Corps squad. All my time has been either in Navy squadrons, either training other people or training myself. I know nothing about it. He said, Major, you're a major in the Marine Corps? I said, yes, sir. I don't know how I am. Well, if you wish to remain one, proceed to El Centro and obey your orders. So I showed up at El Centro, and thank God the colonel, the group commander there, didn't want one of his squadron or commanders to be a guy who knew nothing about what he was doing. Unfortunately, there was a senior major there who had been a regular Marine and actually been overseas, executive officer with fighter squadrons, and knew what he was doing. And his name was Max Reed. Unfortunately, they shoved him into the squadron and pushed me back to executive officer, which all I had to do was do what Max told me to do. So there we were training in an F4 Wildcat, which was a little bit different from the biplanes because you actually could get the wheels up without cranking them, and you had a cockpit cover, and you had a 130 caliber. We had more than 130 caliber. Anyway, we trained in that, and during the period of training, some of the things we did were like strafing targets. And we had our first casualty there. Al Summers was on a strafing run, very low altitude, and that airplane had a thing called the Hamilton Standard Electric Propeller, where you could change the pitch. When you first took off, you put the pitch in the prop to take the biggest bite to give you the most power and thrust, and later on you put it a little bit less for cruising, and unfortunately, this prop went flat, which meant that it was windmilling but producing no power, so he crashed and wound up hitting an irrigation ditch and breaking his back, and was out of it forever. also during that period of 1943, we lost a couple of guys in the Salton Sea, which was just so flat you could hardly tell altitude of the thing. We were practicing fighting against some other troops from up in the Mojave. And all in all, it went fairly well except for that. And we got our orders to go aboard a little CVE, aircraft carrier at San Diego, and we had a little cruise to El Espiritu Santos, which was in the sort of southern end of the Solomon Islands. It had been a French territory for a while. And there we unloaded our fighters from the plane. The captain of the ship happened to have a little blue Jeep. And somehow, strangely enough, not only the planes got unloaded, but the captain's Jeep got unloaded. And about 2 days later, it showed up painted olive drab, and we had our transportation. So there we just familiarized ourselves a little bit with the Corsair, which we had learned to fly towards the end of our stay there in El Centro. This big, unusual looking fighter flew in one day and showed up. It was Charles Lindbergh, who had before once flown across the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, solo. And he'd been hired by Chance Vaught to come to squadrons when we were being newly equipped with this airplane because it had some unusual features. The reason the Marine Corps got the thing in the first place was that it was not suitable to fly aboard the carrier for several reasons. One of them is that the big long nose that it had there, as you approached from the stern, watching the landing signal officer, just about the time he was going to give you the cut and tell you to land or shut off and go around again, you lost sight of him. Another thing about it is that when it landed, quite often, it had a tendency, what's it called, a wire to bounce up and kind of wasn't so good. And when you cut the throttle, one wing dropped at a different rate to the other. So by just great good fortune, the Marines wound up with the best fighter in the world, which has set the world speed limit of 427 miles an hour, I think it was, a level flight. So that was a real plus for us to be flying among the first flying Corsairs. So we went from Espiritu Santos up to an island called Bougainville, which was a very mountainous island with a flat area around what was called Empress Augusta Bay, where after the Marines had recaptured it from the Japanese, the Seabees built 3 parallel fields. We had dive bombers flying from one field, fighters from the other, and at the bottom field with New Zealand, we were still flying P-40s. And what we were doing from there is the opposite of what was happening before. We were now on the attack towards Rabaul, which was a big bastion for the Japanese that was kind of the anchor for them to eventually take Australia down that chain of islands. We, on the other hand, were escorting the SBD dive bombers up there daily, 2 flights a day, and bombing their fields and Simpson Harbor and all that. So we had developed a tactics that Johnny Satch, who was a naval aviator, and invented, which is because we were much faster than the SBDs, we were flying 2 planes in a section, 2 sections to a division, and we would fly opposite of each other over 90 degrees to the course, do like figure 8s constantly, so we always had some guns aimed at whoever might be attacking. So that was called the Satch weave. And that sometimes we would have as many as 2, 3 layers of those above the bombers, depending upon how many there were. When we first started going up there, there were the enemy fighters were like a bunch of bees, just like a none of them in formation, just flying, doing loops and trains and whatnot. And they would attack us. We would try and defend the dive bombers. And it was really very heavy anti-artillery there. Sometimes when you look down and the whole area looked like it was lighted up because of our bombers, bombs, and all the anti-aircraft and whatnot. And it was kind of a hectic few minutes there for a while. You can imagine what it's like to have about 100 airplanes in a cubic portion of air about 5 miles wide and 5 miles long, and planes are spinning down and planes are chasing each other and parachutes are falling and occasionally a couple of airplanes would collide, and for a few minutes there would just be pretty hectic. And then we would shove off and start back to Bougainville. And that sort of thing was going on. And people say, well, how did you feel? What was it like to do that? I said, well, the first time, you know how when you water your garden, the water makes sparkle from the sun? The first time you notice something is sparkling over your wing, you suddenly realize that it's not water. Somebody back there wants to put you out of the game. And we had a defensive maneuver which worked very well. When you did that, you turned immediately into the fire and dove straight down, because we had much better aileron control at 400 knots or more than the Zero, which on the other hand was much more maneuverable and had a tighter circle than we did. But that way you could dive down, and once you reached a pretty good speed, you could make a turn with your ailerons and come out in one area, and the Jap would be unable to follow you. So that was that. And the first time I actually was on a collision course, the Jap fighter was coming in to hit our bombers, and I was on the course to head on with him. And I could see him firing, and I could feel my own aircraft slowing down from the recoil of my 6 machine guns. But how did I feel? I felt no anger, no nothing, except like almost as though I wasn't a participant. It's kind of like a movie that I watched. That was my reaction to it. I don't know what the rest of it was. So one of the flights that we were going on, we would go up twice a day, and of course the Japs knew where we were coming from. They knew what altitude we were coming from. They knew pretty much our airspeed, so they could be waiting and their auxiliary could be set. It was just the opposite of the way it was the year before. One time we had come out of a melee like that, and I had lost my wingman and my second section leader, and I was by myself, and another fighter from my squadron joined up with me, and I thought, well, here I am with all this ammunition, and instead of just going straight home, I'll make a detour by New Ireland, where I knew where there were some Jap installations and radars and that kind of stuff. So we're sailing on down, and I see ahead of me a little cove with a ship, a Jap ship that was partially camouflaged, and it looked like a pretty good target to me. You know, before that, I would do a lot of duck hunting and goose hunting, and what we would do is put out the decoys and go back in the woods and hide and call in the ducks and shoot them. Well, in this case, we were the ducks. The ship was the decoy, and that whole little cove was just rich with all kinds of anti-aircraft fire. So by the time we got in range at about 500 feet, all of a sudden that whole thing opened up. I thought, well, these are ducks are not defenseless. So I poured the coal to her and ripped in there with my 6 machine guns, thinking there were 12 of us. I would make one pass over there, then I'd go on back to Bougainville. Except when I looked to my left, my wingman was not there. Unfortunately, instead of pouring the coal and sticking with me like you absolutely had to do, he pulled up and away and made himself a perfect target. And they shot his plane. and it was going down. Here we are, about within easy flying distance of 3 enemy airfields. He's going down the water, and so he did the proper thing. He lifted his gear up and he pulled his canopy open and he inflated his little water wings and life raft and got in it. And so I needed to call for Dumbo, which was the PBY that would come to pick up down airmen. So I made a circle, constantly circle, as low altitude as I could to avoid the enemy radar. And I did that for, seemed like an interminable length of time. Finally got a hold of Dumbo on the guard channel, and they came. And after quite a long while, I'd lost sight of Joe down there, but I knew he was down there somewhere. And they landed about a block and a half from me and picked him up and took him back to the hospital at Guadalcanal, where later he didn't remember a single thing once his head hit the gun sight when he went down. But among the last flights that we took there, occasionally we would find some Air Force bombers from Port Moresby or wherever they came from, B-17s or B-24s. In this case, there was a bunch of B-24s at about their best altitude. We normally went in at about 12 to 15,000 feet above the target, but of course they were way up there, so we joined up with them and proceeded to revolve, and there was an enormous thunderhead just all over the target there. And so they dropped their bombs in the water and went back from whence they came. Well, here I was, all of a sudden, for the first time, not being tethered to the bombers, not having to stick with them, not having to look to see whether the guy who shot down hit the water or not. There I was with 24 machine guns, a lot of ammunition, over the enemy, 3 airfields in the bomb, and Simpson Harbor, where there were usually some kind of Jap ships. So I thought, well, if I dive down and keep the cumulus cloud between me and the radar and the volcano, we'll come out right over Simpson Harbor at a low altitude. We'll shoot up what we can there, make 2 or 3 passes. And then I took my little pad out and plotted the course from one of the airfields without kind of a triangular course. So we did that, and we went, I think it was to what we call Guadalcanal first, and there were a few airplanes lined up along the runway, and we managed to shoot up a few of those. And I thought, well, if I shoot up their communications tower, it might slow them down a little bit. So we did that, and then we went to the second airfield, which was Ropopo or something like that, and we made 3 passes there. And again, we were fortunate to catch a few of them on the ground, and we left a few of them in burning, and we went to the third field. And by this time, the Japs had finally gotten communications. I guess that something funny was going on, because as far as I know, we had never strafed their fields before. We'd always bombed them from dive bombed them. So we wound up the last field, and sure enough, there were a couple of guys taxiing out, and one guy on the runway getting ready to take off, and we managed to discourage them, and we headed on back to the base. The living conditions there at Bougainville were not like living in a chateau or a castle. There were, not only that, there were no girls of any kind except the nurses back at Guadalcanal, and of course the doctors had them all corralled, so there was what we ate was K rations and C rations, and we lived in little tents with 4 men, little cots for a division. Usually you slept with the same guys you flew with, and it was tolerable, eating K rations and C rations, you had something to eat. But eventually they did get some mosquito nets, and between that time and the mosquito nets, a lot of people got malaria, and that wasn't all that good. But while we were there, when the Marines landed, they shoved the Japs back on the island, but the Japs still had 70-some thousand troops on the island, and the Marines had a perimeter of 25,000 Marines protecting these 3 airfields. And that was fine, except that somewhere along the line, apparently, before they got shoved back, the Japs had some artillery in some caves that overlooked our airfield. And during the night, some of them snuck back into those caves, and one morning they started point blank range with something like 75 millimeters, shooting our wonderful, beautiful Corsairs up. We roared out there, and I managed to get one guy in each plane, and finally the last plane was there, and I took it. It was a plane that had been downed before because it had hydraulic problems and was throwing oil on the windshield and so forth. But anyway, we all got off and we were going to fly back to Vella, which was a field called Barracoma, which they'd been flying from before they proceeded up to Bougainville. So we advanced in the wrong direction. And so here I was, my wingman, Jack Quisenberry, and I was getting more and more oil on my windshield. I could not close the cockpit. The gear would not go down. And so all I could do was look at Jack. I couldn't see anything forward. Of course, in that Corsair, when you're on the ground, taxiing, you can't see anything forward either because of that big nose, but you would zigzag and look behind you to make sure you hadn't gone off the runway. In this case, we were flying that way. So he took me down, and the airfield there was like many of them, was surrounded three sides with water and one side with a mountain. And he took me over the runway and made a turn around, made one more pass, and we slowed me down and gave me the cut. And I landed fine, and from then on I was okay because you couldn't see normally when you taxi, there's nothing wrong with that. So we got up there, and one nice thing that happened to us was the New Zealanders had one of their headquarters there. Wing Commander Campbell had a bottle of scotch, and he just invited me and a couple of the others to come and have that scotch on. And that was really noble. I'm glad we did help each other. So after that, we taken an island called Green Island, which was a little bit closer to Rabaul than Bougainville was. And so we flew up there and we operated there for a while, but by that point there were fewer and fewer Japs coming up, fewer and fewer interceptors, and finally there were none. And so at that point they put us aboard another little Jeep carrier called Santee, and we headed somewhere which we didn't know where we were going, but we wound up first leg at the Marshall Islands, which were new islands called Enewetak and Anjabi and Kwajalein, totally different from our islands. They were flat atolls, just nothing but coral and sand. But there was a fighter squadron there, a Marine fighter squadron located there, flying Corsairs. And so we wound up parked there, awaiting what we found out later was our attempt to recapture the Marianas, Tinian, Guam, and Saipan. So we were there for quite a while, and the skipper of the ship wanted, although there were probably no Jap planes anywhere near, he still wanted the combat air patrol up just in case something, a submarine or something showed up. So I went in and borrowed a Corsair from the folks there that was flying above the fleet, and I tell you, the most awesome sight in my life. And looking down there 2 years before, we'd only had two carriers, and all of a sudden, this whole, as far as your eye could see, the sea was filled with Navy ships. Big aircraft carriers, little aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, troop transport, destroyers everywhere, ammunition ships. I thought, boy, if I could just take a picture of this and send it to the Emperor, this war would be over. So, from then on, they proceeded to take the island back, but we weren't available yet. So we waited, and time came for us to go up there, and we went back on the Santee, and at the appropriate time, we got off the island, and I was stationed on the forward catapult on the starboard side, and poured the full power to her, and she was shivering and jumping and roaring and carrying on, and then all of a sudden they gave me the catapult shot, bang! Dead silence. The engine quit. Here I am with 7 tons of metal strapped to my fanny at about maybe 100 feet, slowing down to about 75 knots. Just before we would have hit the water, that big 2,000 horsepower engine swung that 14-foot prop up it. Took me off, and we landed in Guam. So we landed on a field that previously had been a Jap field, and they had fixed up the holes and so it would run. But here we were, 16 pilots with our aircraft and our 45 caliber pistols, but no support of any kind. Landing a bunch of the ground element of a fighter squadron was low on the priority of the Marines, who were still fighting halfway up the island, and they were landing more important things. So we were there, and our ground troops were still aboard ship for quite a while. So that was kind of a fiasco. Every day we'd go out and wander around and see who could steal or beg or borrow some kind of food from somebody. And we had a great big iron pot, and everybody come back and throw the stuff in the pot, and whatever that stew was, we'd eat it. And whether that was bad cooking or what it was, we all got dengue fever. And dengue fever, if you've never heard of it, is something a pursuit pilot, a fighter pilot doesn't want to have. It's excruciating pain just to turn your eyes to the right or left and turn your head was awful. So we had that for a while, and finally our ground element showed up and set up camp, and we got our little tents and all that, and we had chow, and we were operating normally. And what we were doing there, we didn't know why we were in Guam, because there'd been so much fun, so much action in the South Pacific, and there were no enemy fighters anywhere near where we were. It turned out later on that the war ended in Europe, and they took the B-17 pilots, some of them, and trained them to B-29s, a new aircraft with a longer range, and they were stationed in Tinian to fly to bomb the Japanese homeland. We were there simply to keep the enemy from coming down and bruising our B-29s. The Japs had, from Japan to Ishima, a string of islands down to Guam when they took Marianas, and they had little airfields on places like Pagan and Rhoda and so on down, and we were to bomb those things and just make sure there was no way the Japs could either station themselves there for a while or fly on down. So we became dive bombers instead of pursuits. And the Corsair was a wonderful dive bomber. If we could carry a couple of 1,000 pounds of bombs and a very steady platform, and it did very well. So we spent our time flying back and forth up and down this chain, just bombing. And one day, Colonel Keeley called me in and he said, "Mac, I'm getting some heat. VMS 321 is not doing very well like your squadron and 216, the other. Their availability of aircraft in the morning is down to about 60%, and it should be at least 85%. And the morale over there is not good, I understand. And the generals down in the marshals are giving me some heat about bringing that squadron up. They said, go over there and take command of the VMS 321. And I said, well, that's quite an honor, General, but I'm sure there are a lot of other people far better qualified to do that than me, and particularly some regular officers who would like to have a command. So he ordered me to proceed. So I went over to VMS 321, and I didn't want to be there much anyway because my squadron was set to go back to the States very soon. So it was kind of like in a movie with John Wayne. I made them have an inspection, which they hadn't had in a long time, and I run them down and look at their rifles and that kind of stuff. And I fired the a material officer, and I made a kind of a speech about how this was not a democracy, this was a fighting unit of the United States Marine Corps. It was going to get up to above par pretty soon, and the heads would roll and that kind of thing. So anyway, after not very long, things did get better, and they got up to the right. And then it was ordered back to the States, the VMF 321. And I thought that wasn't fair because VMF 217, the squadron I'd been with for 2 years, had come out before that, and so Colonel Keeley was a really nice gent. So I asked him, Colonel, how about this? I transfer all the pilots that are good out of VMF 217 into 321, and all the pilots from 320 went over to 217 with a few exceptions, and we'll send this squadron home. Okay. So next thing you know, we're loaded aboard the barns and on our way back to San Diego. And unfortunately for us, it was not really intended that the squadron was going to go back for stateside duty. We were sent to the Mojave Desert to transition back to F6Fs because the Navy preferred the Hellcat F6F to the Corsair for the reasons that I said. So here we are at Mojave, very soon to have orders to go aboard the fast carriers, and all we had to do was train the squadron and be ready to go. Well, I said, well, Colonel, if you let me keep all my key personnel, engineering people, ordnance people, communications people like that, we could probably make it, but we got to train them to operate aboard a ship, which they had never done before. So after a while, we were about ready to do that. In the meantime, the Navy had finally gotten enough aircraft, Corsairs, enough people trained to fly them, enough people trained to maintain them, enough spare parts and whatnot aboard the carriers, and they now were going to be the #1 fighter on the carriers. Well, later on, Okinawa and the Philippines, where they slaughtered those kamikazes. But there we were now, no longer in demand. They didn't need a bunch of F6F pilots. So we got transferred to what I thought was the best duty station we ever had, El Toro, Marine Field near Laguna Beach. And we lived at Laguna Beach, and we had good food, and nice place to sleep, and we were supposed to be training new fighter pilots who were joining the squadrons in tactics so that they didn't get killed on their first or second flight. I guess they call it Top Gun now, is about what that training program was like. And we trained a bunch of people that way, and camera guns and all kinds of mock-ups and whatnot. And we did that for a while, which was fun. And finally, November the 5th, I had been selected by the colonel to be the executive officer, and I left the squadron. I was his executive officer. And the Japs surrendered. So there we were, an idyllic situation, no more fighting, and waiting orders. And the colonel called me and he said, Mac, I've recommended you for a commission in the regular Marine Corps. You've been a reserve officer on active duty, but I'm going to recommend you a major in the regular Marine Corps. And I said, well, Colonel, I appreciate that very much. And he said, before you accept this, I want you to know where you're going. Your first duty station will be China. Well, I didn't think my wife would be too happy with me going off for a couple of years in China after just coming back a little while before that. But the main thing was I loved flying in the Marine Corps. I love the big ship planes and all that, but I felt like there will never, ever be another war. We had the atomic bomb. We had dropped it on the Japanese. No one else had it. no country would be stupid enough to attack us or any of our friends or allies, so there would not ever be another war. Of course, we would never attack anybody. So I thought, well, I don't think I want to just practice gunnery and dropping bombs for the rest of my life when I'll never be using them in anger again. There'll be no more war. So instead of which, I went ahead and went on to inactive duty and stayed in the reserve till I was 60 years old. And during that time, I had some 2 weeks active duty every year. The first one was that they sent us to Birmingham, Alabama, where our reserve fighter squad still had some Corsairs. And by the time we got there, they'd all been downed, and so I got my only time in a twin-engine Beach, which was 42 hours in a twin-engine Beach. And I had about maybe 5,000 hours in single-seater fighters. And, matter of fact, I was so lucky that in the time that I was in the Marine Corps, we flew everything from the little F4B4 biplanes that we mentioned before, F2Fs, which were one step above where you could actually crank the wheels up, F3Fs, where they put a canopy over your head, and finally the F4Fs, a Wildcat. And altogether, I flew 31 different aircraft. And one of my best duties was one 2-week active duty in Jacksonville. At that point, the jets were in the Navy, jet fighters. So they had taken a T2, which they called it. It was like a Lockheed shooting star with 2 places on it to check you out in. So we're running down the runway, and I'm thinking, man, this is like a cocktail lounge. Air conditioned, no sound, no heat, no noise, just no torque. But it sure took a long time to get off the ground. Because, you know, typical engines like our big fighters had operated best at low altitudes, but these jet fighters operated best at high altitude. So anyway, we managed to get into the F9F, which was one of the early Navy fighters. They had the Grumman Panther and the Grumman Cougar, and we managed to check out on that. And that was really a real pursuit pilot operation for me. So while that was going on, I had become about somewhere in my 50s, and I got orders from the commandant to do no more flying except with a co-pilot. Well, I didn't want to be babysitting anymore, so at that point, I was no longer a pursuit pilot, no longer a fighter pilot, and so I went on in active duty and stayed at the Corps until I was about 1974, 60 years old. So, I hope none of you here were flying in the Solomon Islands when I was, because you might refute what I have to say, but if you do, please keep it between us. If there's any questions that I can answer, if I don't know the answer, I'll make up something.
Mac, thank you. That was awesome. Well, what do you think? Did he tell you how it really was? What it was like to be a fighter pilot? I wonder if we have any questions. Probably not, huh? Questions? Not one?
Did you ever run into Boynton in the Pacific?
Did you ever run into Pappy Boyington?
Yes, when we were stationed at Espiritu Santos, the way it worked is one squadron would go fly up to Bougainville and operate against the enemy for a week or so and then come back. And then the other squadron would go up. And Pappy was in a different squadron from me, but we were doing the same thing. And occasionally we would pass, when he would be coming in, I would be going back up. And he always somehow, well, I don't know how he did it, but he always had some booze. And so we would have a little poker game and a little booze, and somewhere along the night, you know, Pappy, Greg Boyd, had been an Olympic champion wrestler star at the University of Washington before he came into the squadron. And about one time, a certain time of night, I could see a little glint in his eye, and I decided I would slink away before he started wrestling with me. I didn't want him tearing my arms off. The way he got to me, by the way, while we were instructing in Pensacola way back yonder, there was a group that came by to try to see how many of us would volunteer for the General Chenault had a bunch of P-40s that volunteered fighting with the Chinese. And so a lot of us volunteered, including Greg. But you had to have had a certain amount of time in the actual fighters, not just as we had been trainers before they would take you. So they wouldn't take me, but they took Greg. And that's when Pappy wound up over there. And when he got back, they promoted him as they had everybody else, and he was just right back on the level with everybody else.
Okay, do we have any other questions?
Do you have any aerial victories on that?
Sir?
Did you have any aerial victories?
Aerial victories? Well, it was hard to tell. When the Japs were coming down the chain of island a year or so before, and there was Joe Foss and Marion Carl and Greg Boynton and a bunch of guys there. They had coast watchers who were the islands between where the Japs were coming from, and they would call and report how many were coming and how many bombers and how many fighters, what their altitude and speed was, and they could get those little wildcats up and be ready for them. And they were scoring like 17, 18, 20. Jim Sweat shot 5 in one period. We were the opposite end of it. We were anchored to the bombers, and if you shot something down, you couldn't wait and look and see. You had to see him splash before he counted. So we were not killing a lot in that way. We were just keeping them from killing our bombers. But by my best guess, I probably had a couple in the air and maybe 8 or 10 in those strafing opportunities when we shot up those Jap airfields.
Did you ever read the Hawk? Talk about some of this stuff? Did you ever run into the Hawk?
He's asking you, did you ever run into the Navy fighter pilot by the name of Hawk?
Isn't that good?
Did you ever run into the Hawk? The Navy fighter pilot?
No.
The answer is no.
Good question.
Did you ever run into any Japanese pilots or fighter pilots
After the war. Did I ever run into any Japanese fighter pilots after the war? Actually, the museum had a lot of interesting programs going over the years, and every year they would have a big Navy symposium, and they would have different pilots come in and talk about, like Joe Foss, experience and whatnot. And one of them was a Japanese fighter pilot, a Zero pilot aboard ship. And he claimed, I think, that he shot down 40 American planes or something like that. And they would ask him some questions about what the composition was of the Japs out there. And when he was out there, he said very simply, I was a fighter pilot. I had no idea what was going on.
In the mid-30s, when you entered the Naval Academy with the intention of being a pilot, was that pretty much the only avenue to become the Navy and Reaper pilot? And then later on, when you went to the AFHS program, do you have any problems with those guys becoming pilots, following a different avenue?
What was the question?
The question is was there any difference between becoming a pilot through the Naval Academy or the NAVCAD or MARCAD program?
You mean in performance? I don't think so. They all went through the same kind of training. And I know later on in Korea, many of them were reserved on active duty. They all seemed to perform just about as well as anybody else. And speaking of Korea, which was the war that I didn't think was going to happen, they kept calling up people from my little inactive squadron that I formed here in Pensacola, and taking my people away in terms of Korea. And finally I called the detail officer up at the headquarters and I said, "What about me? Have you forgotten me?" He said, "Colonel, I could get 2 or 3 good second lieutenants for your price, and you'd have a desk job anyway." Enlisted pilots. When we were training, what they call advanced training in Opelika, Miami, there was one squadron there that was all enlisted pilots. And unfortunately, they got the first monoplane fighter of the war, which was the Brewster Buffalo. And they had just been introduced, and they were placed on Midway Island. And of course, the Brewster Buffalo was a terribly underpowered, ineffective fighter, and they lost every single plane in Brewster Buffalo. So that was the one I didn't want to fly. And then one of the other Navy pilots that was in training with me down there in Opelika was assigned to Torpedo Squadron 8. And of course, Torpedo Squadron 8 had those TBD, which was one of the worst fighter planes, so underpowered, invisible, and slow. And of course, they attacked the fleet at the Battle of Midway, and they were all destroyed. Every one pilot lived through it. And unfortunately, even if they'd been able to complete their run, it wouldn't have been very effective because the torpedoes that we had at that day were terrible. They were very slow, and you drop them, and they'd have a tendency to porpoise up and down, maybe go under the enemy ship or fly around in circles. And so it was not for naught, but I'm damn glad I wasn't a torpedo pilot.
Maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Yes.
Have you thought about writing a book about your experiences?
When are you going to write a book?
Speaking of writing a book, I can recommend one to you if you can get your hands on it. Bob Keller, that was my student pilot with me in Jacksonville, stayed in the Marine Corps, fought in Korea, Vietnam. Matter of fact, got to fly with 2 of his sons who were Marine aviators, some in Vietnam, and wrote a book called One Marine, 3 Wars. And how he can remember all the details that he put in them is just incredible to me. But if you get your hands on it, you might really enjoy it, because Bob became a 3-star lieutenant general, and it came time to select the commandant of the Marine Corps, which was always a ground officer, never an aviator at that time. The guy who was the leading candidate, Bob was the best man for the commandant, Adams, told Bob, "If I become commandant, you will be assistant commandant." Well, the president had another Marine on his staff somewhere along the line, and he appointed him to be the commandant instead. Which reminds me, one other active duty I had, General Green was the commandant, and I was back there in Pensacola, and after 2 weeks active duty, he ordered me up to headquarters. And my job was to sit on the selection board whenever you went from captain to major, major lieutenant, and so forth on. They had a lot of officers who examined your past performance and decided whether or not you would be selected. And I'm telling you, this was really very fierce. We got the jackets with all the information about what the guy had performed in the past, and and you presented it to the rest of the selection committee, and they decided who would be selected and who would not. And of course, I was the guy who was making damn sure that some of the flyers got selected. But one thing that I thought was unfair, that was so fierce, I think there was something like 50 officers promoted out of maybe 150 or something like that. But in the meantime, politics has entered the scene, and if you happen to be an engineering-only officer, or like a G4, other than the pilot, other than the regular ground officer, you had to be promoted in the same percentages as the regulars. So quite often people got promoted really, if they'd been just in the regular Marine Corps, they would never be promoted.
Okay, I think that does it for this morning. Mac, we can't thank you enough for sharing your experiences. Thank you so much.
Thank you.